Welcome to Nameless Debate Radio, where radioactivity is contagious. You can join us in broadening our minds on the Nameless Debates Discord via the link below and even feature here yourself, if you've got what it takes.
By that on a normative level and say that morals ought to be true or ought to be relative based on culture.
Yeah,
whatever,
no,
right?
agreed. Exactly. You can't get an is from an ought, so I don't even go there. Or an ought from an is, sorry. Or whatever, I can't remember. But I don't even go there.
You draw from an ought from an is, you were right.
Like, so I accept everything about the vegan standpoint. Like I said, I was vegetarian, would have went vegan or pescatarian if I could have, et cetera, et cetera. Understand that perspective entirely. Accept it, accept the science. Legit, just don't fucking care. Like when I'm going to eat something, if meat is more accessible at that point in time or where I am or how I'm working or suitable to my lifestyle, then meat is what I'll eat. If it's not, then I won't. If I can be vegetarian, I try to be vegetarian generally. That's an unacceptable.
So I think you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Just curious why that's such a big deal.
Well, there's two things there. So if you're saying that, if it takes a lot of effort from you to change like this certain aspect, right? Like I guess change your diet in this case, and how big of that would be that it would just be like just not able to do so, right? Which then we would have to get into a conversation about what's pragmatic in your life or what's necessary and what's not necessary in your life. But
I'm totally capable of it. Economically, accessibility, etc. I live a cosmopolitan lifestyle. I'm totally capable of being vegan if I wanted to.
Yeah, so then they would probably tell you, right? So it would be something like, well, according to your lifestyle, right? It's not necessary for you to have a meat eating diet, so therefore, you should switch because it's not a necessity. Something like that. Because then, if that's the case, right? It's like, all right, well, it goes kind of back in the name to trade thing. Well, okay, well, what if someone?
It's always gonna go there.
Yeah, and it's end up what it goes down to. You know, consistency, or I guess absurdity.
In the end, what I'm kind of getting at, or what I'm thinking is as this argument plays out, and I say, okay, you're gonna argue therefore that being vegetarian or vegan is healthier for me, and I say, I don't care. It's all morally subjective.
Oh, are you talking about health? Or are you talking about
no, anyone, any relevant, if any metric? Because I'm accepting. Let's say I'm accepting the premise that the vegans have the health side one. Like I'm accepting your arguments for that. So if in the end the argument then would be that's better for me, but I just don't care. Is really the stance, is the only stance that they can take a moral frowning upon you?
Well, if you're just if you just like, well, okay, so this is two things, right? So you can just say, well, I don't care about the ethics, I just care about my health. In which case, if you had a health conversation and you accepted that it would be healthier for you, you just don't care, then they would probably say that, well, that's not probably what you care about then, right? So then it'll probably just move into like a moral discussion. And then if you would have said like, well, I just don't care about the ethics or something like that, well, I mean, personally,
how would a vegan argue with? I guess what I'm asking is, how would a vegan argue with a nihilist?
A prescriptive nihilist?
Yeah, let's go with that.
Because like me, like I'm a descriptive nihilist. I don't think anything matters necessarily, but I think subjectively things matter. So like, are you talking about someone who subjectively thinks that nothing matters, or just like?
Well, okay. Yeah, you're right. We're getting too deep into nihilism. I was trying to keep it simple. Let's do an objective nihilist. No, let's do a subjective nihilist because I'm making the argument from a subjective standpoint. Let's do a subjective nihilist.
So you personally like act in the world as like you believe that meaning shouldn't exist at all type shit. Like you ought not to care about anything.
I don't think anybody ought to do anything.
Okay, well, because I'm trying. Well,
I think
what I'm trying to
only
are you saying personally that you have no? So you're saying that as a subjective nihilist. So like we can clarify, right? You're saying that you don't care about anything, right?
In this standpoint, yes.
All right. So what I would say, I would push back on that and say, well, you do care about some things. regardless of your answer. And so I would
And
say, well,
could I
huh?
actually outline those right now? Because I will admit to that. But let's
Mhm.
say that the only thing I care about are like, but what would be considered moral in that worldview would be a biological response, involuntary or so deeply written in DNA that it's borderline uncontrollable. It's the only thing that could be argued to for any form of morality in that sense.
Sure. Like
I
if
and
you're,
I'm saying as an ought. That's the only thing that could be an ought. Like, I ought to breathe. I ought to drink water.
yeah. So I think you're just so. I mean, I think this is just you describing like the nature of. I mean, how ought to work, how morals really work in the world, like kind of an emotivism thing, right? I mean, all moral expressions are just your emotional states.
Yeah,
If you,
I like to
yeah,
approach arguments from boiling them down to their simplest possible components and then building upwards from there.
yeah. I mean, I don't necessarily disagree on the meta ethical stance there, right? I mean, I'm a pretty firm like Humean subjectivist um type. So, but so, and again, I'm just telling you what most would. The way I approach the problem is different, but in terms of most people, they would then say, well, something like if all you care about is just whatever desires you have, um, what if I gave you like a drug or you had some type of weird intuition change? Well, would that be justifiable just because you start having those desires? And just for example, like someone gets a tumor in their hypothalamus and goes out and shoots up a mall, some shit like
Yeah, yeah. We'd
that.
be getting into like free will at this point, right?
Well, I mean, you don't really have to. And the problem is that the difference is that again, I would approach this problem, right? So just if I took the carnage side, I guess, on this, right? I would say something like, well, if we know that it's true that that normative statements are just expressions of our emotional desires, right?
Mhm.
Then if I did get a drug and it changed my intuition, whether you like to believe it or not, you would fundamentally do what those emotional states are. I mean, you are controlled by your emotional states, right? So I would just I mean, I mean, I would just approach it from a purely like if, and this is talking about the meta ethical stance, not even normative. Like, I'm not even saying what we ought to do is follow our desires. I'm saying like how we are in general. It's just that, like, that's the nature of humanity.
Okay. So yeah, you're taking what I would call a pragmatic approach to it because it's how I approach things too. You just don't want to you don't want to assume too much before you get into the deep end. The only reason I asked this question or why this whole thing because when I'm around this community, I seem to constantly hear this conversation about who the vegan community hates. The vegan community is like hates the carnists, the vegans, the vegetarians, the pescatarians, like who they hate more. So I'm just curious what they're like where they're making this stance on whether or not somebody is to determine that like, oh, they're
Yeah.
fucking annoying to our community. Is it because they don't have the same moral standard, or is it because they have a different moral standard but they think they can effectively argue against ours?
Yeah. See, this is the thing, right? So a lot of probably for lack of a better term, probably the more philosophically illiterate vegans, they claim that they're moral subjectivist, but argue with this weird embedded moral realism or moral objectivism. And um, I think, I mean, at the end of the day, right? If you don't agree with their moral stance, just like most groups, right? I mean, just to take the Nazis and the Jews, or whatever group, you're gonna have just emotional conflictions there. I mean, the vegan or group isn't that different from any other type of group with an ideology. But I mean, in my opinion, though, I don't think a bunch of vegans are like irrational. I mean, I don't think it's like a bunch of them. I mean, unfortunately, you probably only talk to a few of them that are, but like you have some pretty smart, intelligent vegans out there.
Yeah, I don't doubt that. I don't deny that. I guess in the only realm I would be considered or concerned with it would be because my main focus is politics, and I don't really see the vegans gaining power in any form of regimen or format that would be authoritarian or concerning to me. So
Yeah.
yeah, I don't really engage in the vegan conversation a whole lot. I just being in this server is the first time I've constantly heard about it so much, and when I'm listening to it, I'm like, okay, it's really interesting that they go so deep into philosophy for a fucking vegan conversation, because you have these conversations, but they turn into philosophical conversations that are then like how can anybody get that deep into the philosophical conversation and then still walk away saying I have an objective moral point of view? It's very hard to be a moral objectivist in the philosophical community or
Well, I mean, there's nothing, there's forms of what I would say moral realism, right? So that you can say something like moral values are universal. Now it would be obviously you, because you can't drive in from an is, right? To say that we should follow that would be a subjective moral claim. But in essence, like there's some vegans actually who do believe in objective morality that I've talked to.
So,
But most yeah, most vegans are more subjectivist, at least on Ask Yourselves survey. But as far as the politics going, I mean, when you're talking about activism, right? It's just a different field than just discussion. So like activists, right? I've always said like emotional discourse is the best way to go instead of some type of philosophical discourse. Because number one, most people don't really care about the philosophical shit. They just want to know like why should I care about this, right? Or
yeah.
oh well, how bad is this? Well, how does this make me feel? And personally, I don't see veganism being large scale unless there's some type of really efficient market that is equivalent in the taste preference of that of regular meat. I mean, I don't really see like unless there's some type of like capitalist solution. I don't really see it being that popular, to be honest with you.
What about the so I make an argument for capitalism as from the perspective of it being it's almost nihilistic, but from the main perspective of it being that capitalism is so deeply embedded not just into the structures that humans have built as social constructs, but literally written into our DNA. The way we compete and the way we survived in nature is something we've biologically adapted to being, and capitalism is more advanced expression of natural selection through a more complex means. Um, and
Hmm.
I'd make the same, and just from a fact, I'm just thinking about this now, so this idea is probably full of holes, but I'm just tossing it out there. Is from that perspective of same with meat and sustenance in our societies, farming specifically, being so ingrained into how we structure our societies. I don't see how a vegan could make yeah, from a political standpoint, that it wouldn't concern me because I don't see them ever being able to reach a point where they could say we're going to abolish cow farms, because you couldn't. That is so deeply embedded within the structure of the system that I don't think you'd be fighting a battle that's even worth winning.
Um, you know, I can see your idea about capitalism, but I don't necessarily think it's that natural in respect to other forms of government. I think the most natural type of government anyway is just like complete. I mean, we're just talking about this like straight up, social Darwinism. Like I
Yeah.
think capitalism. I guess capitalism in itself. I mean, has some. You can see correlations of that with like Darwinian selection, sure. Um, but I think capitalism is there's a couple of problems, right? So it's like first thing is that uh, when you're talking about like individuality, it's not like evolution isn't so individualistic as like obviously you do have individual competition, sure, but a lot of evolutionary growth, especially when in terms of like human societies, is really like a lot of it's like group based, and it's still kind of like a controversial thing in biology, but you can see a lot of evidence for like group selection and like
Oh
hive
yeah.
mind behavior and shit.
Yeah, and well, so that's one of the things that I take two steps back, and when I'm talking about like you see the
Uh-huh.
expression of capitalism. That's why I like to look at capitalism as you got to look at it a little bit differently than how a communist would look at it when they're saying capitalism versus communism. But
Uh-huh.
communism, I would agree in this sense, for the way I'm framing this, that like communism has never really existed. because communism was functioning under capitalistic means and around a capitalistic society. And even when you're in communism, I can create arguments for this one too, that even when you're in communism, people are going to act in a capitalistic way. If there's some, if you're all getting an equal amount of food, but there's some dude who doesn't need to eat as much food as somebody else, and he can then have a backlog of food, he then has created capital just out of his sheer function being less than what the guy who's 6'3" needs to eat in a day. The accumulation of capital is an inevitable construct when you have humans or humans getting together. It's something that we do once we're aware that we're capable of doing it, and the bartering and power that it provides us. But at the same time, we're always living in that capitalist structure, but within that, in the way that that's always expressed through our DNA, traditionalism, liberalism, the different forms of any of your isms are it's not I don't want to get caught in naturalistic fallacy. They're all expressions through DNA. Like even being a Republican, if we could narrow down the SNPs appropriately, we could sit there and go, okay, this person is biologically more likely or very likely to be a Republican versus a Democrat versus wherever the fuck they are, whatever this environment around them is allowing. So it's those. Yeah, so that's the kind of expression that I'm talking about, where it's that level of where it's expressed in our genes.
Yeah, so I guess I agree with that. There's a really good book by Hide It. Fuck, what was the name of it? It was like
Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah, Jonathan Haidt. Yeah. And he talked about this. He has his own theory of how political groups tie to like certain psychological things about humanity. But with communism, so the closest thing there really was to communism was probably like early communal groups, like way back when in our evolutionary history.
Yes.
As far as communism, though,
still exists within families too.
Yeah, and a lot of thing about communism that I think there's, not saying that you are necessarily, but there's certain straw mans I feel about communism that a lot of capitalists or people on the right like to say, which is like, everyone gets the exact same, or there's some shit like that. Like even Marx himself, like the exact quote, I don't remember, but it was something along the lines of like, for each his own. And
every man from each according to his capability, to each according to his need.
Exactly, right. And so the idea is that even in a communist system, you're still gonna have people, you're only working, you only get what you earn, right? That's just you own the means of production, right? Like the whole idea that a doctor would get the same as a McDonald's worker is just it's like an asinine straw man.
But you get that right there. Like, so my argument that I'm making, that's why I say it's don't get bogged down in the communist capitalist thing. It's capital, not capitalism. Capital is a inherent part of structures that humans create. And it's written into us back from when we were monkeys. Monkeys accumulate capital. It's some of the best experiments they've ever done, where they see that shit going on, where monkeys learn how to barter with each other and stuff. So the accumulation of capital is something that is, even in a communist society, you're going to have an accumulation of capital.
Yeah, you're gonna have you're even gonna have differences, and like inequality would still exist, right? Just obviously be a lot smaller, but it would still you would still have people, people who like hierarchies aren't gonna go away, right? Yeah, as much as you try to stop it on some type of ideological level, you're gonna have hierarchies, and hierarchies, probably as have existed. I mean, and you can look at all animal groups, you'll see hierarchies.
I view them as being written. That's kind of one of the points I'm making. Yeah, I view them as being written to the genetics.
Yeah, exactly.
Good conversation, bud. Good conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm Googling up Jonathan Haidt here right now because I remember what.
Thank you for listening. Like, share, subscribe, and join us in the Nameless Debates Discord. We hope to see you there.